The cold wind howled across the Montana prairie as Aurora Anderson clutched her father's weathered hand, watching the life fade from his eyes with each labored breath. It was late August 1876, and the golden wheat fields that stretched across their homestead remained unharvested, a cruel reminder of dreams unfulfilled and promises broken. "Papa, please," Aurora whispered, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "The doctor will be here soon." "Just hold on a little longer." Thomas Anderson's cracked lips formed a weak smile. "No time left, my sweet girl, the wheat, the harvest." His voice faded as he struggled to communicate his final worry. "Don't think about that now," Aurora insisted, squeezing his hand tighter as if her grip alone could keep him tethered to this world. "Promise me," her father rasped, his blue eyes suddenly clear and urgent. "Promise me you won't lose the farm. It's all we have left of your mother." Aurora nodded, her chestnut hair falling across her tear-stained face. "I promise, Papa, I promise." As the last breath left Thomas Anderson's body, Aurora felt the weight of her 22 years multiply tenfold. The farm that had been her family's dream now rested solely on her shoulders, along with the mounting debts, the unharvested fields, and the looming threat of winter. She stood at the window of their modest cabin later that evening, staring at the wheat swaying in the twilight. Without the harvest, she would lose everything. But how could one woman bring in acres of wheat before the autumn storms arrived? The morning after they laid Thomas Anderson in the ground beside his beloved wife, Aurora rose with the sun, determination setting her jaw in a hard line. She pulled on her father's work shirt over her dress, rolled up the sleeves, and headed for the barn. The ancient harvesting scythe felt awkward and heavy in her hands, but she had no choice. By midday, she had managed to clear only a small corner of the nearest field. Her blisters had formed and burst, her back screamed in protest, and tears of frustration mingled with the sweat on her face. At this rate, she would never finish before the first snow. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A lone rider approached, his silhouette dark against the brilliant blue Montana sky. Aurora straightened, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun, the other still gripping the scythe. The stranger rode a magnificent chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders and the set of his jaw giving him an imposing presence. As he drew closer, Aurora could see he wore the practical attire of a working cowboy, not the fancy garb of the bankers who had been circling her father's property like vultures. "Afternoon, madam," he called, touching the brim of his dust-covered hat. "Name's Daniel Keating. I'm looking for work, and they said in town the Anderson place might be hiring for the harvest." Aurora almost laughed at the cruel irony. "They were mistaken, Mr. Keating. I can't afford to hire anyone." She gestured toward the vast expanse of wheat. "My father died 3 days ago, and I'm trying to bring in the harvest myself." The cowboy's expression softened as he dismounted, leading his horse closer. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Miss Anderson." "Aurora," she said automatically, then wondered why she'd offered her given name to a stranger. Daniel looked out over the fields, then back to her raw, bleeding hands. "You'll never finish alone, not before the weather turns." "I don't have much choice," Aurora replied, lifting her chin with stubborn pride. "I promised my father I wouldn't lose the farm." Daniel removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark brown hair and thoughtful green eyes that seemed to evaluate the situation with a practiced gaze. "I need work, Miss Aurora, and you need help. I'll take payment after the harvest is sold." Aurora shook her head. "I can't guarantee. I'm not asking for guarantees," Daniel interrupted gently. "Just a chance to earn my keep and help someone who needs it." Before Aurora could respond, Daniel reached for the scythe. "This won't do for a field this size. Do you have a cradle scythe in that barn?" I think so. My father had several tools, but I don't know much about them." Daniel nodded. "Let's take a look then. Daylight's wasting." Something about the quiet confidence in his voice made Aurora relinquish the scythe and lead him toward the weathered barn. As they walked, she noticed his slight limp and wondered what story lay behind it. In the cool darkness of the barn, Daniel quickly located the cradle scythe, a more efficient harvesting tool with wooden fingers that caught and laid the grain in neat rows. "This will serve us better," he said, testing its weight. And you have a good grinding wheel for keeping it sharp. Us. Aurora questioned. Daniel's eyes met her steadily. Yes, madam, us. I can't let you lose your farm when I have two strong arms to help. For the first time since her father fell ill, Aurora felt a small flame of hope ignite in her chest. I can't pay you much, Mr. Keating. Daniel, he corrected with the hint of a smile. And we'll worry about payment when the wheat's in. Do you have a spare room where I can bunk? Aurora hesitated. Having a strange man stay on the property would raise eyebrows in town. Her reputation was already precarious as a single woman alone on a farm. Reading her thoughts, Daniel added, I can sleep in the barn if that's more proper. I don't need much. The barn will do, Aurora agreed, relief evident in her voice. There's a small loft with some clean straw. Perfect, Daniel said, hefting the cradle scythe over his shoulder. Now, if you'll show me your property lines, I'll get started right away. As they walked the boundaries of the Anderson farm, Aurora felt a curious sense of comfort in Daniel's presence. He asked practical questions about the soil, the wheat variety, and the average yield from previous years. There was nothing presumptuous or threatening about him, just a steady competence that eased some of the overwhelming burden from her shoulders. Your father did well with this land, Daniel observed as they surveyed the golden fields. This is quality wheat. He worked himself to death for it, Aurora said softly. The farm was everything to him after my mother died. Daniel's expression grew solemn. Then we'll make sure his last crop comes in properly. True to his word, Daniel began work immediately. Aurora watched in amazement as he moved through the field with practiced efficiency, the cradle scythe slicing through wheat stalks as he laid them in neat rows. His movements were rhythmic and powerful, despite his limp becoming more pronounced as the afternoon wore on. When dusk approached, Aurora called him in for supper. Daniel washed at the outdoor pump, the cold water sluicing away the day's sweat and dust. At the kitchen table, he ate ravenously but with impeccable manners, complimenting Aurora's simple stew and biscuits. Where are you from, Daniel? Aurora asked, curious about this man who had appeared when she needed help most. Daniel took a sip of water before answering. Originally Kansas. My family had a small cattle operation there. Had, a shadow crossed his features. Lost it in '67. Drought took the cattle, bank took the land. Aurora nodded sympathetically, and since then been working my way through the territories. Cattle drives, ranch work, whatever pays honest wages. He flexed his calloused hands. Was heading to Oregon when I passed through your town. What's in Oregon? Aurora asked, pouring him more coffee. Daniel's eyes took on a distant look. Land, government still offering homesteads to those willing to work for them. He smiled faintly. Thought I might try my hand at having roots again. Aurora understood the yearning in his voice all too well. That's a fine dream. Just a dream for now, Daniel replied pragmatically. Need to save more money first. After supper, Daniel insisted on helping with the dishes before retiring to the barn. Aurora watched from the doorway as he crossed the yard, his tall figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, Aurora awoke to the sound of the grinding wheel as Daniel sharpened the scythe before dawn. She dressed quickly and prepared a hearty breakfast of oatmeal, eggs, and the last of her father's smoked bacon. As they ate, Daniel outlined his strategy for the harvest. We'll need to work from sunrise to sunset if we want to beat the weather. I can handle most of the cutting, but I'll need you to help with binding the sheaves. Aurora nodded eagerly. I can do that. I've helped Papa before. Daniel looked at her doubtfully. It's hard work, especially for someone not accustomed to it. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Keating, Aurora said firmly, and this is my farm. A smile tugged at Daniel's lips. So it is, Miss Anderson, so it is. They established a routine over the next few days. Daniel would cut the wheat while Aurora followed behind, gathering and binding the stalks into sheaves. They worked in companionable silence most of the time, the rhythm of their labor punctuated by occasional conversation. Aurora learned that Daniel had fought briefly for the Union in the final year of the war, though he spoke little of that time. His limp, she discovered, came from a cattle drive accident 3 years prior when a startled steer had pinned him against a canyon wall. Doctors said I'd never walk right again, Daniel told her as they paused for water. But a man needs his legs in this line of work, so I made sure to prove them wrong. Aurora admired his determination. You certainly move well enough with that scythe. Years of practice, Daniel replied modestly. My father put a scythe in my hands when I was 12 years old, said a man should know how to bring in a harvest even if he raises cattle. By the end of the first week, Aurora's hands had toughened and her muscles had adjusted to the demanding work. The nights brought bone-deep exhaustion, but also satisfaction as they watched the harvested portion of the field grow steadily larger. They were racing against time, and they both knew it. The evenings were growing cooler, and the morning dew heavier signs that autumn was deepening. If rain came before they finished, the wheat could mold or sprout in the fields, becoming worthless. On the 9th day, disaster struck. Daniel had been working since before dawn, pushing himself harder than usual as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Aurora saw him stumble, the scythe slipping from his grasp as his bad leg gave out beneath him. She ran to his side, heart pounding with concern. Daniel, are you all right? His face was gray with pain as he tried to stand. Just need a minute, he gasped, but when he attempted to put weight on his injured leg, he fell back with a grimace. You've pushed too hard, Aurora said firmly, sliding her shoulder under his arm to help him up. We're going back to the house. The rain's coming, Daniel protested, looking at the darkening sky. We need to get more cut before it hits. Not at the cost of crippling you, Aurora insisted. Lean on me. Together they made their slow way back to the farmhouse, Daniel's weight heavy against Aurora's smaller frame. Inside, she helped him to a chair and knelt to examine his leg. It's swollen badly, she observed, gently probing the old injury. You need to stay off it for at least a day. Daniel shook his head in frustration. We don't have a day to spare. We don't have a replacement for you either, Aurora countered. If you damage your leg permanently, where will that leave either of us? The logic of her argument finally penetrated, and Daniel conceded with a nod. One day, he agreed reluctantly, but only if the rain holds off. As if in answer, the first heavy drops began to patter against the roof. Within minutes, the gentle shower had become a downpour that drummed steadily overhead and turned the farmyard to mud. Daniel's expression darkened as he watched the rain through the window. This could set us back days. Aurora brought him a cup of hot coffee, or it could be over by morning. Either way, your leg needs rest. Confined to the house, they spent the afternoon in a domestic tableau that felt strangely comfortable to Aurora. She prepared a medicinal poultice of herbs her mother had taught her to use for inflammation and wrapped Daniel's leg carefully. He submitted to her ministrations with only minimal grumbling, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. The rain continued through the night, a steady rhythm that accompanied their quiet conversation by lamplight. Daniel told stories of his travels, cattle towns and mining camps, mountains and deserts, painting vivid pictures of places Aurora had only read about in books. Have you ever seen the ocean? She asked, curled in her father's old rocker with a quilt around her shoulders. Daniel nodded. Once in California, worked a ranch near San Francisco for a season. What's it like? Aurora's eyes were bright with curiosity. Daniel seemed to search for the right words. It's endless. Makes you feel small, but not in a bad way, more like you're part of something bigger than yourself. He paused, then added softly, reminds me a bit of the prairies, actually. Same vastness, just water instead of grass. Aurora smiled at the comparison. I'd like to see it someday. You should, Daniel said earnestly. There's a whole world beyond Montana territory. I know, Aurora sighed, but this farm is my world now. It's all I have left of my family. Daniel studied her thoughtfully. A farm is just land, Aurora. Your family is in your memories, your heart. You carry them with you wherever you go. His words touched something deep within her, and Aurora found herself blinking back tears. No one had spoken to her with such understanding since her father's death. Thank you, she whispered. They fell silent, the rain and the crackling fire the only sounds in the cozy room. Aurora found herself watching Daniel's profile in the flickering light, noting the strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. He was handsome in a weathered, authentic way that the dandies in town could never match. She caught herself and quickly looked away, startled by the direction of her thoughts. Daniel was her hired hand, nothing more. Her precarious situation didn't allow for such distractions. The rain continued through the night but tapered off by morning. Aurora woke to find Daniel already up, testing his injured leg cautiously. "How does it feel?" she asked, tying an apron around her waist as she prepared to make breakfast. "Better," Daniel replied, though Aurora noted he was still favoring it. "The fields will be too wet for cutting today, but we can check on the sheaves we've already bound, make sure they haven't blown over in the storm." Aurora nodded, relief washing over her that his injury wasn't more serious. "Breakfast first," she insisted. "No sense facing mud on an empty stomach." After a hearty meal of flapjacks and bacon, they ventured out to survey the damage. The wheat still standing in the fields was flattened in places where the rain and wind had been heaviest. The portion they'd already harvested had fared better, though some sheaves had indeed toppled over. "Could have been worse," Daniel observed, squinting at the cloudy sky. "If we get sun today and tomorrow, the fields should dry enough to continue cutting by the day after." They spent the day righting fallen sheaves and moving the driest ones to the small barn for threshing. Daniel was clearly in pain but refused to stop working. Aurora kept a watchful eye on him, insisting he take frequent breaks. During one such rest, sitting on a hay bale with cups of water, Daniel suddenly asked, "What will you do after the harvest?" Aurora looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean? Will you stay and plant again next spring, or sell the farm?" His tone was carefully neutral, but his eyes were intent on her face. Aurora hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. "I promised Papa I wouldn't lose the farm," she said slowly, "but I don't know if I can manage it alone, season after season." Daniel nodded, understanding in his gaze. "It's a hard life for anyone, especially a woman on her own." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Aurora said, a flash of pride in her voice. "I never thought you were," Daniel replied with a slight smile, "but there's a difference between being capable and being happy." "Is this the life you want, Aurora?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in so long that she'd almost forgotten to consider it. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I've never really had the luxury of asking myself that question." Daniel's expression softened. "Everyone deserves that luxury, at least once in a while." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a wagon coming up the road. Widow Johnson from the neighboring farm, bringing a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "Thought you might need some cheering after that storm," the older woman said as she climbed down from her wagon. Her sharp eyes took in Daniel's presence and her eyebrows rose. "I see you've found help for the harvest." Aurora made the introductions, acutely aware of how it might look to have a strange man working on her property. "Mr. Keating has been a godsend," she explained. "I couldn't possibly bring in the wheat alone." Widow Johnson nodded approvingly. "Smart girl." "Your father would be proud of your practical thinking." She handed over the basket. "Though you might want to consider having the preacher out for Sunday dinner just to quiet any wagging tongues in town." Aurora blushed. "People are talking." "People always talk, dear," the widow said with a dismissive wave. "Better to acknowledge the situation openly than hide and give them more to speculate about." After Widow Johnson departed, Daniel gave Aurora a concerned look. "I don't want to damage your reputation." "Widow Johnson is right," Aurora said decisively. "We've done nothing wrong. I'll invite Preacher Davis for Sunday dinner as she suggested." Daniel seemed relieved. "Good, the last thing I want is to cause you more problems." The fields dried more quickly than they'd hoped, and by the following afternoon they were able to resume harvesting. Daniel's leg was still troublesome, but he worked through the pain with grim determination. Aurora found herself watching him with growing admiration, not just for his physical strength, but for his unwavering commitment to helping her. Sunday arrived clear and bright. Aurora spent the morning preparing a special dinner, wanting to impress both Preacher Davis and, she reluctantly admitted to herself, Daniel. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and even pinned up her hair in a more elaborate style than her usual practical braid. Daniel, too, had made an effort. He'd shaved carefully and donned a clean shirt she'd washed for him. When their eyes met across the kitchen, something unspoken passed between them, a current of awareness that made Aurora's heart beat faster. Preacher Davis arrived promptly at noon, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of Aurora. "Miss Anderson, you're looking well despite your recent trials." "Thank you for coming, Preacher," Aurora said, ushering him inside. "I'd like you to meet Mr. Daniel Keating. He's been helping with the harvest." The preacher shook Daniel's hand firmly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, sending help when we need it most. I'm pleased to meet you, young man." Daniel inclined his head respectfully. "Likewise, sir. Dinner was a pleasant affair." Preacher Davis blessed the food with a heartfelt prayer that included thanks for Daniel's timely arrival in their community. The conversation flowed easily, with the preacher sharing news from town and stories of the early days when the territory was first being settled. "Your father was one of our pioneers," he told Aurora. "Came here when most thought this land would never yield crops. He proved them wrong through sheer stubbornness." Aurora smiled fondly. "He was stubborn, wasn't he? Used to say that was the most important quality for a farmer." "That and faith," the preacher added, turning to Daniel. "What about you, Mr. Keating? What brings a cowboy to try his hand at wheat harvesting?" Daniel met the older man's gaze steadily. "Good timing and good fortune, sir. I was passing through looking for honest work." "And your plans after the harvest?" Aurora found herself holding her breath, suddenly intensely interested in Daniel's answer. "That depends on several factors," Daniel replied carefully. "I was originally headed to Oregon, but plans can change." The preacher nodded thoughtfully, his wise eyes moving between Aurora and Daniel. "Indeed they can. The Lord often has different paths in mind for us than the ones we imagine for ourselves." After dinner, Preacher Davis asked to speak with Aurora privately. Daniel excused himself to check on his horse, leaving them alone in the parlor. "He seems a good man," the preacher said once Daniel was out of earshot. "Steady, respectful," Aurora nodded. "He's been a tremendous help. I couldn't have saved the farm without him." "And is that all he is to you?" "Help with the harvest." The directness of the question made Aurora flush. "I hardly know him," she protested. "He's only been here a couple of weeks." Preacher Davis smiled gently. "Sometimes a few weeks is all it takes to recognize quality in a person." "And sometimes, Aurora, God sends us not just what we need, but who we need." Aurora looked down at her hands. "Even if there were feelings, Daniel has his own plans. He's heading to Oregon after the harvest." "Is he?" The preacher raised an eyebrow. "That's not quite what I heard him say." Before Aurora could respond, Daniel returned, and the conversation shifted to more general topics. When Preacher Davis prepared to leave, he clasped Aurora's hands warmly. "Your father would be proud of you, my dear. Not just for saving his farm, but for the strong, compassionate woman you've become." Tears pricked at Aurora's eyes. "Thank you, Preacher," he turned to Daniel. "And you, young man, I hope we'll be seeing more of you in our community." "Thank you for your hospitality," Daniel replied. "It's been a pleasure meeting you." After the preacher's departure, a new awareness hummed between Aurora and Daniel. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning a new step, suddenly hyper-conscious of every glance and gesture. As they washed the dishes together, their hands brushed in the warm, soapy water. Aurora felt a jolt of something electric pass between them and quickly withdrew her hand, nearly dropping the plate she was rinsing. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, though it wasn't clear whether he was apologizing for the accidental touch or something deeper. "It's nothing," Aurora insisted, but they both knew it wasn't nothing at all. That night, Aurora lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, her mind filled with conflicting thoughts. Daniel would be gone once the harvest was complete that had been their agreement. So why did the thought of his departure now fill her with such dread? The next week passed in a blur of intense labor. They worked from dawn until dusk, racing to finish the harvest before the weather turned. The wheat fields gradually transformed from gold to stubble as they methodically cut, bound, and stacked. Each day brought them closer to completion and to the inevitable moment of parting. Aurora found herself treasuring every moment of Daniel's company. Their conversations during meal breaks, the way he anticipated her needs without being asked, the gentle way he helped her when her strength began to flag late in the day. He had become more than a hired hand, he had become essential to her in ways that went far beyond the harvest. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Daniel broke the comfortable silence between them. "Aurora," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart skipped nervously. "What is it?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I haven't been entirely honest about why I was passing through these parts." Aurora turned to face him, concern evident in her expression. "What do you mean?" "I wasn't just randomly looking for work," Daniel admitted. "I knew your father." Aurora stared at him in shock. "You knew Papa? How? When?" "3 years ago, I worked a cattle drive that passed near here. One of our steers got loose and trampled part of your father's wheat field." Daniel's eyes held her steadily. "I was the one sent to make amends." "Your father was angry at first, rightfully so, but when he understood it was an accident, his whole demeanor changed. He invited me in for coffee, showed me around the farm." Aurora's mind raced, trying to recall if her father had ever mentioned this incident. "I don't remember him talking about that." "It was during harvest season. You were away visiting relatives," he said. Daniel continued. "What I remember most was how proudly he spoke of you, said his daughter was the smartest, most determined young woman in the territory." Tears sprang to Aurora's eyes at this glimpse of her father through Daniel's memories. "He made an impression on me," Daniel said softly. "His dedication to this land, his pride in what he'd built. When I heard in town that he'd passed and his daughter was trying to bring in the harvest alone, I knew I had to help." "So you came here deliberately," Aurora whispered. "Not by chance at all." Daniel nodded, looking somewhat apprehensive about her reaction. "I felt I owed him that much. He showed me kindness when many farmers would have just demanded payment for damages." Aurora processed this revelation, emotions swirling within her. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I wasn't sure you'd accept my help if you knew," Daniel admitted. "I thought you might see it as charity or pity, and it's not that, it's respect, for your father and now for you." Aurora was quiet for a long moment, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains. Finally, she said, "Thank you for telling me now, and thank you for coming back. It means more knowing you did it for Papa." Daniel seemed to relax slightly, relieved by her response. "There's something else, Aurora." She looked at him questioningly. "My plans for Oregon." He hesitated, then continued with determination. "They're not set in stone. In fact, lately I've been thinking there might be reasons to stay in Montana." Aurora's pulse quickened. "What kinds of reasons?" Daniel's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. The kind that make a man reconsider everything he thought he wanted. Before Aurora could respond, a sudden gust of wind brought the scent of rain. They both looked up to see storm clouds gathering rapidly on the horizon. "We need to check the sheaves," Daniel said, rising to his feet. "Make sure they're secured before the storm hits." Aurora nodded, though part of her wanted to finish their conversation rather than worry about the wheat, but practicality won out. The harvest had to be protected. They worked quickly in the deepening twilight, reinforcing the stacks of wheat sheaves and covering them with tarps where possible. The wind grew stronger, whipping Aurora's skirts around her legs and tearing at her hair. "That's the last of it," Daniel called over the rising gale. "We should get back to the house." They were halfway across the field when the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Within moments, the gentle shower transformed into a downpour. Daniel caught Aurora's hand, pulling her toward the barn, which was closer than the house. They burst through the barn doors, soaked and breathless. Daniel secured the doors against the wind while Aurora fumbled to light the lantern that hung just inside. The soft glow illuminated their dripping figures as they stood facing each other in the sudden quiet, the storm's fury muffled by the thick barn walls. Aurora became acutely aware of Daniel's proximity, of his hand still holding hers, of the intensity in his eyes as he looked down at her. Rainwater trickled down his face, catching in his eyelashes and on his lips. "Aurora," he said, his voice low and husky, "I need to say this while I have the courage." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Yes." "These weeks with you have changed me," Daniel said, his words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. I came here to repay a debt, but I'm staying because I can't imagine leaving you. Aurora's breath caught in her throat. Daniel, I know it's too soon, he continued earnestly. I know you barely know me, but I had to tell you how I feel before Aurora silenced him by rising on her tiptoes and pressing her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, sweet, and filled with promise. When she pulled back, Daniel looked stunned. I don't want you to go either, Aurora whispered, surprise at her own boldness mingling with certainty that she meant every word. Daniel's face transformed with joy. He cupped her face in his calloused hands with exquisite gentleness. Are you sure? Your life is complicated enough right now without adding me to it. Aurora smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. You haven't complicated my life, Daniel Keating. You've saved it. This time when they kissed, it was deeper, a meeting of souls that had recognized each other across the wheat fields. The storm raged outside, but within the barn, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one of hope and possibility and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. We should get back to the house before we catch our death in these wet clothes. Aurora nodded, but neither of them moved immediately, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. Eventually, they dashed through the rain to the farmhouse, where Aurora built up the fire while Daniel brought in more firewood. They sat before the hearth, wrapped in quilts, their wet outer garments hung to dry. The storm continued outside, but they were safe and warm, talking softly of dreams and possibilities. The farm needs a lot of work, Aurora said pragmatically. The roof leaks in 3 places, the north fence is falling down, and the well pump needs replacing. Daniel smiled at her practical assessment, all things that can be fixed with time and effort. It's a big commitment, Aurora cautioned, needing to be sure he understood what staying would mean. So is Oregon, Daniel replied. The difference is Oregon doesn't have you. The simplicity and honesty of his statement warmed Aurora more than the fire ever could. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, as if the storm had washed the world clean. They surveyed the wheat fields together, relieved to find that most of the sheaves had weathered the storm intact. 2 more days of cutting, I reckon, Daniel estimated, squinting at the remaining wheat. Then the threshing can begin. Aurora nodded, feeling a curious mix of excitement and trepidation. The completion of the harvest would mark a new chapter, not an ending, as she'd once feared, but a beginning. They worked with renewed vigor, their shared secret adding a layer of joy to the labor. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the field, and a smile would pass between them, private, intimate, full of unspoken promises. Word spread quickly in the small community that Aurora Anderson had found help with her harvest. Neighbors began to stop by, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but really to assess the stranger who had taken up residence on her farm. Daniel met their scrutiny with unfailing politeness and evident capability, gradually winning over even the most suspicious. Widow Johnson became their most frequent visitor, bringing baked goods and staying for long chats with Aurora. After one such visit, as the older woman was preparing to leave, she pulled Aurora aside. He's a good man, she said quietly, nodding toward Daniel, who was splitting firewood in the yard. The way he looks at you when you're not watching, that's how a man looks at his future. Aurora blushed. We're taking things slowly. The widow patted her hand. As you should, but don't take too long, dear. Life is shorter than we ever expect. 2 days later, as predicted, they cut the last of the wheat. Aurora bound the final sheaf herself, tying it with special care. That's it, she said, straightening up with a smile of triumph. We did it, Daniel. Daniel leaned on the scythe, surveying the field of stubble with satisfaction. Your father's last crop, it's done. The simple statement brought tears to Aurora's eyes. Yes, she whispered, it's done. Daniel crossed to her side, taking her hands in his. He'd be proud of you, Aurora. Not many would have fought so hard to keep his dream alive. Aurora looked up at him, suddenly certain of what she needed to say. It was his dream, Daniel, but now I need to find my own. Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. And what is your dream? A life that honors his memory but isn't bound by it, Aurora said slowly, finding the words as she spoke them. A farm that thrives, not just survives, and, she took a deep breath, someone to share it with. Someone who sees me as a partner, not just Thomas Anderson's daughter. Daniel's face softened with emotion. I see you, Aurora. I've seen you from the first day, strong, determined, compassionate, everything I could ever want in a partner. He dropped to one knee in the stubble, still holding her hands. I know it's fast, I know people will talk, but I don't want to waste another day pretending I'm not completely in love with you. Aurora's heart soared. Daniel, Aurora Anderson, will you marry me? Build a life with me here on this land that means so much to both of us. Aurora pulled him to his feet, tears of joy streaming down her face. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, I will. Their engagement announcement caused the expected stir in the community, but with Preacher Davis's blessing and Widow Johnson's vociferous support, the gossip quickly turned to wedding plans rather than scandal. They were married on a crisp October day after the threshed wheat had been sold at a better price than Aurora had dared hope. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Widow Johnson's skilled hands. Daniel stood tall and proud in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Aurora as she walked down the aisle of the small church on Preacher Davis's arm. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises of partnership and devotion that moved many in the congregation to tears. When Daniel kissed his bride, the cheer that went up seemed to shake the rafters of the little church. The wedding celebration lasted well into the evening, with neighbors contributing food, music, and dancing. As twilight fell, Daniel led Aurora away from the festivities and back to their farm, their home. Standing on the porch in the gathering dusk, Daniel swept Aurora into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keating." Aurora laughed as he carried her over the threshold. "I've been home all along." "You're what was missing." Later, as they lay in each other's arms, Aurora thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought Daniel to her door when she needed him most. What had begun as a desperate race against time had transformed into a love story neither of them had anticipated. "What are you thinking?" Daniel murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Aurora smiled in the darkness. "That sometimes the greatest harvests are the ones we never planned to sow." Daniel pulled her closer. "And sometimes the places we're just passing through become the only place we ever want to be." As winter settled over the Montana prairie, the Anderson Keating farm hummed with activity and plans. Daniel reinforced the barn and repaired the leaky roof before the first heavy snow. Aurora preserved the last of the garden vegetables and began piecing a wedding quilt from scraps of meaningful fabrics: her mother's apron, her father's Sunday shirt, the blue dress she'd worn when Daniel first kissed her. They worked side by side, equal partners in all things. When spring arrived, they planted the wheat fields together, Daniel's strong hands guiding the plow while Aurora walked beside him, dropping seeds into the freshly turned earth. By the following harvest, Aurora's belly was round with their first child. Daniel insisted she rest while he brought in the wheat, now aided by 2 young men from town whom they could afford to hire thanks to the previous year's successful crop. Aurora would often sit in the shade, watching her husband work the land her father had loved, her hands resting protectively over their growing child. In those moments, she felt her parents' presence most strongly, as if they were smiling down on the new life taking root in the soil they had cultivated. When their daughter was born that autumn, a strong, healthy girl with her father's green eyes and her mother's determination, they named her Hope. It seemed the perfect name for a child born of unexpected love and second chances. As the years passed, the Anderson Keating farm prospered. They added cattle, remembering Daniel's roots, and experimented with new crops that diversified their income. 2 more children joined their family, a son named Thomas after Aurora's father, and another daughter they called Faith. On the 10th anniversary of Thomas Anderson's death, Aurora and Daniel stood together at his grave, their 3 children gathered around them. Daniel had carved a new headstone from local granite, more substantial and permanent than the wooden marker they'd originally placed. "He gave us everything," Aurora said softly, laying wildflowers on the grave. "This land, this life." Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. "And in a roundabout way, he gave us each other." Aurora leaned into his embrace, watching their children place their own small bouquets on their grandfather's grave. "Do you ever regret not going to Oregon?" she asked, a question she hadn't voiced in years. Daniel turned her to face him, his weathered face still handsome, his eyes still filled with the same love she'd first seen in the barn during that long-ago storm. "Not for a single moment," he said with absolute conviction. "My life began the day I rode onto this farm and saw a stubborn young woman trying to harvest a wheat field with the wrong scythe." Aurora laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie wind. "And mine began when a limping cowboy appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I'd made." They walked home hand in hand, their children running ahead through fields that had witnessed their struggle, their love, and their triumph. The farm that had almost been lost was now thriving not just as a memorial to what had been, but as a living testament to what could be when courage and love took root in fertile ground. As they crested the hill and saw their homestead spread before them, the sturdy house with its new addition, the red barn, the golden wheat fields ready for harvest, Aurora felt a sense of completion. Her father's final harvest had indeed been finished, but it had yielded so much more than wheat. It had yielded a legacy, a love, and a life richer than she could have imagined. "It's beautiful," she said, squeezing Daniel's hand. "Yes," he agreed, but he wasn't looking at the farm, he was looking at her, the most beautiful harvest of all.